Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You're listening to Newcastle Fast FM, and it gives me great pleasure to say assalamu alaikum to you, sisters and brothers, ladies and gentlemen, tuning in after our great, blessed month of Ramadan with myself, your host, Wajid, and our special guest and speaker for this evening, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. Jazakallah khair. I think since we last did a show, so much has been happening, and we've been having a chat about putting a show together that really explores the idea of identity. Because for those of you who followed us during the month of Ramadan, you had the pleasure of understanding the cycle of belief systems that we go through, the moments that we go through, and how we grow from being sort of from a youthful stage to the adults, well, from the knowledge, from data to youthful to adult, and to moving into the wisdom stage, and how our emotions evolve with that, with our faith as well, inshallah. And that was something we covered in a lot of detail, Dr. Abdul Haqq, and,
yes.
and it was very useful for all of our listeners. So Jazakallah khair. I think what we wanted to do with this show was, inshallah, we will be hosting every Monday night at 8 p.m. GMT. And we will be exploring elements of identity. We'll be exploring ideas of societal issues, contemporary challenges, and we'll be bringing that discussion into this. And as our guest here, Dr. Abdul Haqq, will say, inshallah, that we want you, as our listeners and our viewers, to chime in. Drop in questions, let us know what you think. And I'm also going to say as well, very much so, that the views and opinions are of myself as the presenter and of our guest, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker. And we're here to really challenge each other, have a good discourse, and get you involved in kind of what the contemporary issues are, and bring your ideas forward. And in a way where we are creating a safe space for you to be able to ask about certain things, because let's be honest, we don't know everything. I certainly don't. And it's through that dialogue, through that discourse, coming from a genuine and sincere place, that we can ask open questions in such a way that we can get some idea and understanding, and hopefully defrag those misconceived ideas of identity, of our belief, and what it means to be sort of, well, at the moment, Dr. Abdul Haqq, even being human in the world today.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah. I just wanted to pick up on the format of the discussion is very much so, like I said, you can engage with us live and broadcast as we go on through. Please do send in the questions, and we should see them, inshallah, coming up on the live stream here. So we'll be able to respond to those as soon as and as appropriately as we can. And I think the first thing we wanted to pick up on was around, well, when we talk about identity, it's all over the news, and it's not just all over the news in the US, and that's been broadcasted to us here, but it's all over the British news and news across the world. We're really taking a strong look at ourselves right now when it comes to not ourselves as from our own identity, but from how we perceive and recognize and other people, how we choose the perceptions of other people's identities.
Yes, indeed. And I think that from a Muslim perspective, this always opens a very sensitive wound that we as Muslims have not overcome ourselves. And that's the racism at micro level, a very large micro level, if that makes sense, among ourselves, where you'll see that there's a racism that's pervasive from the predominant Muslim communities towards the minorities among those communities, who happen by and large to be Black communities, be they converts or be they from the African continent. And I'd like to add something to the structure and format that we've discussed already, Wajid, if that's okay, and that we don't want this to just be a discussionary or discussion platform where airing of views takes place. We want to see if we can go on a journey similar to what we did in the previous Baker podcast, where we gave structures, suggestions, and plans of action for ourselves. And if this can be a conclusive aspect of each episode of each show, whereby we look at some of the things that we can be doing to overcome the inherent racism. And there are different categories of racism, which I think we need to look at, a societal perspective and a religious perspective, with the latter being the more overarching and encompassing of all ethnicities and races. I think we need to look at aspects of that and then go away each week. And we're not going to be focusing on this every week, but whatever it is that we're focusing on, if it's a societal or religious issue amongst our communities with relationships, that we look introspectively and we address them. And it would be good to hear from viewers coming back each week to see how they may have improved, challenged, or identified other problems to discuss further. But one thing we need to be very honest with, all of us, this is a very, very painful period where sensitivities are going to be challenged. And that's happening in conversations within families at the moment, from individuals who've contacted me from abroad, from friends, colleagues who are having discussions with daughters, sons, asking questions about what's happening, cultural aspects. And we need to make sure that we are tapped into that within our own families, within our own communities. Because if we're not, and we're going to do what some Muslims have started doing already, which is to bring verses of the Quran, which we all know and we all believe in, to bring hadith and to bring really nice statements, the last sermon of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the white is not superior to a black, bringing all of those almost as statements to shut down any further discussion, and then bring in very idealistic statements that Islam knows no color or racism. And that's an absolutely correct premise to bring, but Muslims are separate from Islam in that, because racism is alive and kicking amongst Muslims, and they're not, and we are not adhering to these noble and lofty tenets and guidelines regarding racism and how to avoid it in Islam.
Yeah, and Jazakallah khair for that, because it is about that introspection, and that's really what it is that we talked a lot about before around self-awareness, and the idea that an education should be about that self-education, really. You know, how do you use that knowledge and actually apply it in a practical day-to-day kind of way? Otherwise, it's just data, like we've said before. And like I said, we're encouraging our viewers to get involved, to put in and to begin this kind of idea of, actually, this is what I think and this is what I understand. And, you know, together, like you said, we take that journey and we start to unravel it, because it is a challenging time, because in some ways, some people don't know what to do. Some people want to do stuff, but they're not quite doing it in the correct kind of way. And we see that, you know, a lot in the media, you know, certain people speaking up about certain things, and it's not done in a way where they're truly connected with the issue at hand. It just feels that that's what they feel is the right thing to do. And the sincerity is there, but the way that it's being done isn't quite, you know, reaching out, like you said, you know, or in what is very much a painful scenario.
Yes. So when you've got, for example, I've had some white colleagues and friends contacting me from America, the UK, elsewhere, Pakistani friends, and they're actually asking questions. That they're good individuals, but they're asking questions. And from the white perspective, they're saying, we, like the white America, some of them are saying, we realize our privilege now. We are so sorry that we've been in a bubble. We saw James Corden crying and breaking down on TV, saying, I didn't realize all of this. What can I do? And they're asking, what can they do? And not be patronizing. And I think that as white America is doing that as well, saying, how can we help? And instead of these statements, all lives matter, what about Kashmir? What about the Uyghurs? This is not the issue, because when we're focusing on the Uyghurs, you don't hear the black community saying, what about black people? And conflating and therefore diluting and diminishing the focus of the moment. And the focus of the moment now is one that is centuries old. We know about the plight of the Palestinians and what happened with An-Nakaba. And that's still painful to us as Muslims, even though the people like us who grew up and be converted to Islam. But what about 400 years plus of a people being displaced, being treated as cattle and commodified for industry? And that's not happened to the extent that it's happened with the transatlantic slavery. It has not happened. And so we need to awaken and enlighten others to the origins. And again, I've said it on nearly every show, I've said it in articles. And our Muslim colleagues who come from the predominant communities, South Asian and Arab, need to know that our starting point, and I say our, I'm talking about myself as a black individual, Afropean, I like to call myself, because it encapsulates the Caribbean, Afro, and the European aspects of my identity. Our lives and our history predates slavery. And what predates slavery includes kingdoms to which the first fledgling Muslims on Hijrah traveled to. Abyssinia. And we need to acknowledge the position of blackness in our faith, its excellence and its contribution, and the fact that these countries and these societies in Africa embraced Islam before South Asia, before much of the Arab world. And that acknowledgement, if it's recognized, will then start shifting our perceptions as we consider black people, as we consider other darker ethnicities, including in India, where there's the caste system, the very caste system that unfortunately has transferred over to Muslims.
Yeah.
So this is painful
from the Indic subcontinent. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
This is painful to consider, and some may not like hearing this because it runs very, very deep. But it's a cancer that needs to be rooted out, and we need to start somewhere. And I believe the discussions that are taking place are an initiation of this. And yes, people are being bombarded, and the amount of messages and YouTubes and archives that are being sent to me, and I'm looking at them, and I'm hesitating to share what I know. Like in one of the groups, I'm in a group of excellent individuals, predominantly South Asian, professionals, doctors and everything. And they've started asking questions. And they were bringing very recent arrests of past arrests, not just George Floyd and the others. And I said, if you really want to get to the depth of this, I can send you pictures of lynchings where you've got the family sitting around, the children standing there posing with the mothers, with a picnic, sitting there smiling beside this hanging body. I can send you pictures where you've got little children being fed to crocodiles and they're halfway being eaten. But so this is graphic, what I'm describing here. I have lived, we black people, we have lived with these images and these archives since childhood. We've lived with them. We've lived at walking down the street, and when we hear a siren, freezing because we don't know if that car is coming for us and what it's coming to us for. How many of the listeners who are not from my background or ethnic background or profile have had to live their lives like that? How many? So we need to really penetrate deeply in order to understand, empathize, and see how we can help, even if it means not being patronizing. All lives matter. Not being patronizing. George Floyd was a criminal, so why are we sticking up for a criminal? And this is what some white Americans are saying. And we say, well, hold on a minute. Look at the criminals who established America. They looted the entire continent and destroyed and displaced the people. And we have the 45th president who is a womanizing abuser and a criminal himself. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Now you want to talk about the criminality of someone who was murdered. He was a criminal. He had a criminal background. However, he should never have been treated the way he was treated. No one deserved that type of treatment, ever.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, the gruesome imagery that you were mentioning there, I have seen some of that stuff, and it's not so much that the gruesomeness of the mutilation and the total disrespect and dishonoring of just the simple human rights of an individual, but it's the fact that it was a form of entertainment.
Yes.
To look the other way was perfectly fine. And actually, you know what? It's kind of we're getting together, and this is like one of the events.
Yes.
the kids are having a party, they put a piñata up, right? That's a standard thing. But
Right.
it's similar in that similar kind of vein, and it's it's something, like I said, I come from the Kashmir mountains, and I've lived my own life, but the depth that you're talking about is not something that I've experienced, because I've not lived it at all.
Right.
I have heard it from friends, brothers, sisters, colleagues that I've worked with, and colleagues that I cherish, and really feel kind of at a loss in the sense of what it is that, where do I stand in all of this? And to the extent now where I am asking myself, really, what is my own belief system in all of this? And do I really ascribe to those tenets which you spoke about? And you mentioned, that that the first group of Muslims that were being persecuted, that were being tortured, that were being killed, after this was after the shuhada of Sumayya radiallahu anh.
That's right.
The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, go, find sanctuary, go somewhere else. And they sent them there to a king, to a just, an adil king, who listened to what they had to say, asked them the intelligent questions. And once he understood what it was they were doing, he understood these guys weren't troublemakers. They weren't there to create a ruckus. They were actually speaking something good. And he gave them sanctuary, and he gave them protection against those who were persecuting them, who were very powerful at that time. All things considered.
Those who were powerful from the Quraysh came with humility and respect to another kingdom that rivaled theirs. This is important. Such was the establishment of this African kingdom at this time. And we have to acknowledge another thing, a connection. Let's join some dots. Bilal radiallahu anhu, who we're always referred to in deference, but in a way I see it's to sanitize the black community. He was a wonderful companion, an illustrious companion. His mother was from that same kingdom, that same established society. So Bilal was not a lowly individual. His father was Arab as well. He was one of the captives of war, as there were many captives of war. There were others, Suhaib, Rumi, just like we saw in Europe. The captives of war were enslaved. But this seems to be the connotation that the slavery of Bilal and the transatlantic slavery of some of my forefathers and many in America, these are the parallels that are drawn. And then from that, there's a post-colonized perspective and understanding and prejudice that now permeates amongst South Asian and Arab Muslims. And that's come from that distorted and twisted perspective regarding slavery. And that's for the transatlantic slavery. But they don't view Bilal radiallahu anh through that same lens. And that's good. But then why do they then view us through the lens of transatlantic slavery? They don't perceive or bother to acknowledge that there was a history preceding slavery where many emanated from kingdoms, the Songhai kingdom, Mali, and these kingdoms, where many obtained aspects of their civilization from. So there's an inherent prejudice that's there that needs to be shaken to its core amongst our own co-religionists, the more culturally based ones. I'm living in the Middle East, and while I haven't experienced racism myself, I'm not dumb or ignorant to the fact that racism is pervasive amongst particular segments of the Arab community, as well as it is the South Asian community. And some may say, well, what about black racism? Now, that's a different construct that we need to talk about. We're talking about a racism where communities and society has the ability to implement structurally that racism upon those minorities. Black people in the West don't have those strictures, those apparatus to inflict that in a similar way to the wider, more predominant communities and wider society. So there are different contexts we are talking about with regards to racism. As I said, there's a societal structural one and there's a religious one. If we're focusing on the religious one, then all of us come into that xenophobia, that looking down on another race because we think we're better than them. That applies to every single one of us without without exclusion.
I'm really thinking about what you're saying, because it's like you said, it's about constructs. And there's a comment that's come through here, and it says here that images and sharing I have a problem with, as it is something, it just perpetuates the spectacle of the black body. And I think there's this thing we get brought up with, it's like, when you watch Star Trek and the guy who goes with Dr. Spock and the captain, that person's going to get shot dead. Do you know what I mean? There's these cliches that become this thing, and you mentioned it also. When you did the Moon and Black, about the poetry, about looking at someone and coming up with these perceptions. But from an early age, we're educated in this way. From an early age, we're taught about, especially now, we're taught that evolution is the thing, that we've all evolved from this thing, and this is how we've grown and become this thing. But within that evolution, that teaching of evolution, we're taught that those who are closest to, the animal relatives, right, are less evolved than those who are more evolved. And this is something that gets ingrained in us, that we don't always see it for what it is.
And to speak to that point that you've mentioned, I'm going to read to you here the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution that exists now. So here, the 13th Amendment forbade slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted. So more than a century later, the prison labor system has grown, okay? And basically, it's an institute whereby black people are being incarcerated again, and that 13th Amendment is being cast aside, because now they can be back in servitude. That servitude is okay within that context. So let's see here, equating enslaved blacks to 3/5 of all other white persons match the ideology of the founding racists on both sides. So assimilationists and segregationists argued that black people were simultaneously human and subhuman. Seemingly all embraced black inferiority. These two groups embraced that black people were inferior. And in the process, they enshrined racist ideas in the nation's founding document. By the 17th of September, 1787, delegates in Philadelphia had extracted the word slave and slavery from the signed US Constitution to hide their racist enslavement policies. So in basically, if you look at the US Constitution, black people are considered 3/5 human. You can't have 3/5, 3/4, half a human. It's not human. A human is 100% human. That exists today in the Constitution. And that's why that 13th Amendment, in order to cast that to the side and re-enslave further generations, you have the prison industrial complex now, and disproportionately blacks who have been put on a lower strata of success in those societies, come from school, failed education, poor environment, lack of resources, educational resources, and they're on one projectile that predominantly sends them to prison, where they then lose much of their rights and then are basically reenacting an aspect of 21st century slavery. This is what's happening. And this perception that's here in America traverses our communities. And it's predominant in some particular cultural communities. And when you've got the caste system from the Indo-Pak subcontinent and you place that beside the post-colonial construct regarding black people, you've got a really insidious type of racism that is difficult to permeate.
Yeah, there's just so much to unpack there. But if I can just bring in a little point, when the British Empire, it was in the late 1800s with the Boer Wars in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And it was during those wars that many British soldiers were killed in the battle. Right. And so they decided that they needed cannon fodder, basically. Yeah, that's the way to put it, right? And that's when they started to recruit black and ethnic minorities into the battlefield. But even then, they wouldn't allow black people to move up the ranks, as it were,
No, that's
because
right.
of their belief in evolution. That
Yes.
these people are more on this side of the evolution scale, and therefore those who were lighter skinned were deemed to be more intelligent. And this was the belief system, and that's why you see that load of them were brought over from the Indian subcontinent to be that part of that.
Right.
And you know, I remember reading an article, I think it was around First World War, Second World War, about soldiers, American soldiers coming over to the UK, and you know, black soldiers were sitting being served by white women in the cafes, basically, and
Right.
then the black soldiers were like, you know, they were aghast by it. You know, they were like, what is this? You know, this
Yeah.
would never happen in America. And so I think there's constructs that are there to ensure that certain things remain a certain way in order to ensure the status quo. Now, the status quo can only remain if that number is big enough to not allow the change to happen.
Right.
Yeah. So the overall majority who has the advantage and the privilege will not want to, because they call it downgraded, but you're not downgrading your privilege. You're actually giving other people their human rights to be able to have that true equity, not equality, but equity and fairness in society.
And what you're saying there is, sorry, to interject, what you're saying there about constructs, when we look at narratives that have become prevalent, let's look at something very simple, and stereotypes. There's that stereotype that's been perpetuated for generations now that black people are lazy. Yet you see the most athletic and the ones with the most prowess and successful in the field that society has allowed black people to excel in, and it is an allowance, is sport. But then let's go further back, because the contradiction in terms is that an entire people, millions, were transported to build America, to toil in the fields, and while Europeans and white Americans, new Americans, sat back and lived a life of luxury as slave masters, as overseers in that instance. And that's perpetuated up till today, because now you have a narrative that's been there for a long time, which has provided justification for the police force in the UK and in America to be violent with black populations. And I want to quote just an excerpt from Robin DiAngelo's famous book, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And she states here, the language of violence that many whites use to describe anti-racist endeavors is not without significance, as it is another example of how white fragility distorts reality. By employing terms that connote physical abuse, whites tap into the classic story that people of color, particularly African Americans, are dangerous and violent. In doing so, whites distort the real direction of danger between whites and others. So when we look at the direction of danger, it's from the whites to the black population. And we've witnessed that in the Latin Americas, in the Americas, the genocide of the white Europeans when they've gone and conquered land. We've witnessed that in Africa. We continue to witness this in a 20th, 21st century context. Let's look at the US and the wars it's enacted. Let's look at when we've recently commemorated the dropping of nuclear bombs. In this instance, who has done all of that? Who has perpetrated these disgusting, despicable crimes? And this now is not to attack and berate white Europeans and white Americans, but let's speak to the reality, that language of violence that is attributed to black people. And some will say, oh, but they're all killing each other, and black on black violence and such. Let's look at the statistics. If you want to look in the UK at so-called black on black violence and compare it with white on white gang violence, you'll see that the white on white gang violence is more in preponderance than black on black. Let's be frank on that instance there. But this narrative has taken root. It's there amongst the Asian communities, The Arab communities, be careful of this black guy, be careful of these black individuals. They're violent, they're lazy. And another one I'm going to lead us to now, which is a parallel again. And we don't want them coming and marrying your daughters, your sisters. There's no way you can have someone of that background being married among our communities. And I repeat, like I mentioned very recently, that we're not after the Asian women. That this is a fallacy, just like we saw in the case of the brutal murder of Emmett Till, a young 15-year-old in the early 20th century, by him just saying hi to a white woman in the shop. She went and told her husband. Some who don't know this story, look it up. Emmett Till, E-M-M-E-T, Till, T-I-L-L. And the mother did open casket because she wanted the world to see what they had done to her son. Brutal pictures. So basically, that language of violence was, oh, they want our white women. And this incensed white people in the similar way that we see it incenses South Asian and Arab communities. But let's be clear, we need to make a distinction here. Black communities are not after your women. Let's be, I'll say that. And the black women are not looking to run after other ethnicities as well. This is not by design. So we need to put that out there, because this is a narrative that's coming out at this time as well. Oh, the only thing you'll hear is that they say they can't marry our women. So if they could marry our women, would there be any issues they'd be speaking about racism? Move that to the side. Yes, there will be many, many issues of racism that we have to deal with and address, including, like what happens in wider society, that providing a pocket and a bracket in which black success, so-called success, is allowed to succeed. This is also happening in the wider Muslim communities, where black Muslims are being facilitated to be either entertainers, nasheed artists, the entertainment industry in that particular, sportsmen. This is where they're getting their accolade. But you're not seeing acknowledgement for the many doctors, the many engineers, the many scientists. You're not seeing that. So you're seeing a mirroring at a microcosmic level amongst Muslim communities of what's taking place in wider non-Muslim society. And this is unacceptable as well.
Yeah, and I think, again, it feeds into that that sort of set narrative of things. Like you said, you're either going to be a sports person, or you're going to be this, or you're going to be that. And that's kind of the broad categories that you will slot into. And like you said, there's many doctors, there's many engineers, there's many of it. I think there's a very famous the famous doctor who came up with blood transfusion. I believe he was a black doctor, and ironically, they didn't give him they wouldn't give him a blood transfusion because he was black. I think there was something like that. I don't know how much of a myth that is, but again, yes, so many of these things come, but it comes from going beyond sort of the sort of that facade, as it were, that thin veneer of moving that away and seeing people for what it is. And I think, given what you've just said there, Dr. Abdul Haqq, there's an element of being able to become introspective at this point and sort of reflect on that. Because like you said, there's these, because if you think about it, what you've just said there is kind of what the right wing say about, if you look at what happened during Brexit, yeah, it was very much a similar kind of narrative. They're all going to come flooding in the boats. They're all going to take all of your jobs. They're going to take all of this. They're going to do all of that, and that's it. We're going to be overrun. So it's always this threat. There's always a threat. There's always a fear. There's always this danger and this creating of otherness that gets done. That was done during the Brexit thing, and we know that our own Prime Minister here, the sort of comments that he's made, outwardly racist comments, and yet not be held accountable and responsible for it. And it just demonstrates to us that there is very much a hierarchy There's very much a hierarchy that exists. Even if you look at sort of the Dominic Cummings situation, where he drives, up to the northeast, hundreds of miles, because what? Because there's no childcare in London. Well, that's got nothing to do with the failing government.
That's after he visits a beauty spot.
Yeah, well, he had to have his eyes tested, So again, but you see the narrative that comes out of that, the number of excuses, that get generated just to support that hierarchy, that's clique, and that group, to ensure that status quo does not get shaken up. And I think it.
That's what you're saying when we speak about Dominic Cummings and everything. Again, let's juxtapose that amongst our own communities. And here again, I want to bring you yet another quote from one of the articles that I was writing. And listen to this: white solidarity is the unspoken agreement among whites to protect white advantage and not cause another white person to feel racial discomfort by confronting them when they say or do something racially problematic. Now let's remove white solidarity and let's put South Asian solidarity and replace all of white with South Asian or with Arab. So what is the solidarity that is there amongst us as same culture, co-cultures? Let's say amongst black people, if we're talking about the overarching understanding of racism, when it's our own and we see racism in our own families from our parents, why they don't want their daughter to marry a black man, why a black individual doesn't want his daughter to marry an Asian or an Arab or a white man. And we see and we hear and we witness the racism, as I've done. And I've had aunties, Pakistani aunties who I was close to, calling me, asking me to dissuade their sons. This was amazing because they trust me, they love me, I love them. And it's like, Abdul, you are our nephew. Please dissuade my son from wanting to marry this black sister, this black girl. And I'm looking at the auntie and like, have you seen my color? I'm the same as the person you're dissuading. And they know that. I said, yes, but you're different. That stereotype, you're different. No, I'm not different. I'm the same. So we need to look at what we are letting pass among our own family. It's uncomfortable. And please let me make it clear for the viewer. This is not just to do with marriage. This is when comments are being made, insulting, derogatory comments concerning other ethnicities. And we listen and we may smile at it. We may grimace, but we won't say anything about it. So as we said in this at the outset of this show, we really need to look at ourselves and see how we can effect change when this show finishes. Everyone's been hearing a lot of noise at the moment with what's taking place. It's endless. I go to bed exhausted. I wake up exhausted. I look at my phone and see the hundreds of messages and people wanting to speak to me and show and share things with me and asking me questions. As you said, we don't have all of the answers. Yes, I have an experience in addressing this issue. Why? Because like many black people, this has been part and parcel of my life. I haven't faced the racism that others have, some of the raw racism. Yes, when I was growing up, I did from white society and knew how to deal with it, and came to the brunt of it in the very brutal arrest and assault in my case, which I've spoken about in a separate video, and dealt with that. But within the biggest shock for me, and I will say this emphatically now, the biggest shock for me and many converts when we came to Islam was the racism that we witnessed amongst Muslims, especially knowing that this is the perfect religion and what the Quran says, what our final prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muhammad says, Al-Mustafa says concerning censure of racism. And knowing that that's there, the religion, this is enshrined in the religion, and then to witness the type of racism that is pervasive amongst the predominant community, this had many of us questioning ourselves. Obviously, we came because of the deen, but when we saw this from the Arab world, from the South Asian world, we asked, well, what religion are they practicing? We laud Prophet Muhammad, not laud, but we revere Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we should do. But yeah, and we have examples from him. But while we're talking about George Floyd and how bad it is in wider society, we have to look inwardly, and on a microcosmic level, but significant microcosmic level, as I said earlier, our communities are conveying a similar type of racism. And that's why you've got these Pan-African movements and individuals speaking, saying Islam is not for black people. They even enslaved black people. They didn't only enslave black people, mind you. We know that Europeans and others were enslaved, but they enslaved black people. Look at the treatment of black people. Then you see these images of maids in the Middle East and some of the bad treatment that's been taking place with some of these maids. And they use this to highlight that this is Islam, not culture or abuse of culture or religion, but they say this is what's happening. So this then, it makes black people who are looking at Islam detract from Islam. It makes Muslims who are in the faith isolate themselves from these communities, because when you've got individuals going into a predominantly Asian mosque and individuals don't want to stand next to them to pray, or are questioning, how are you Muslim? How can you as a black man be Muslim? That shows, reveals a level of ignorance that is alarming, because they can say, hold on, our continent became Muslim before yours. So what are you asking that question for? So education is needed at this particular point, and the level of introspection that needs to take place is a very, very painful one. So as I said about the noise, don't let the noise go away, because if you're shutting out the noise, then there's a refusal to deal with some inherent problems in our communities and to self-reflect on any hidden prejudices that we may possess in ourselves and that we are transferring to our children, to our siblings, or we are taking from our parents.
We're just heading towards the last 5 to 10 minutes of our show, Dr. Abdul Haqq. So I kind of want to, because this is discussion that we will continue on next week again, inshallah. But it was just to really sort of pick up on kind of what we've chatted about, in the sense of the perception of black people, this idea of being commodified, of being something that is traded, you know, like apples and oranges, basically, and even treated in a way and discarded in a way where it's not even a consideration. And we've covered quite a few things in the sense of not just sort of the reaction to things, but the perpetuation of beliefs and of ideas that get put out there, and where they come from. And I think sometimes, like you said about, you know, sort of from the South Asian community, when you are born with something, then it does feel very much part of your identity, and it feels like, you know, you don't realize the privilege that you have because you're born with it. Do you know what I mean? You know, it's like when people sort of say, people from the UK, when they say, well, if your leader's doing this, why aren't they speaking against that leader? And it's like, well, you don't know what it's like in that country. When you speak out against that leader, it's not just you, but your whole family's going to disappear. That's, you know, right. They don't recognize the realities of other dictatorships and realities of other parts of the world. And I think similarly, we don't have that full and true understanding, and it's not. Maybe it is empathy to at least start to unpick and unravel the realities of what has been happening to a whole segment of a very large part of our community. Just then, it's not like, you know, black people are a few. There's only 100 of them in Minnesota or in Birmingham. There's not, you know, there's millions of them, but that systematic oppression that's there, that, you know, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, you know, Allah does not change a condition of the people until they change the condition of themselves. But I'm not saying that in the sense of towards our black sisters and brothers. I'm saying that towards ourselves, in the sense that what is it that we are holding on to, right, as Muslims, that we need to let go of, because it does reek of that jahiliyyah that we were supposed to let go. And right. And in order to let go of that, you make space for something else. That's how it works, that nature abhors a vacuum. So you release something, you make space for something else.
But also know this, because that's very important that you're saying that. I want you to know this about us as a black people. We are a very proud and dignified nation and race of individuals. And we have an illustrious past that we are moving back towards to reconnect with. Those histories of Abyssinia, those histories of Mansa Musa, who remains today the most wealthiest man recorded in living memory. 400 billion was his worth. Okay. And as he traveled to Makkah, building cities as he went along and donating, we have an illustrious past. And we are slowly but surely reconnecting with that, because history has literally been whitewashed. Okay, so when I was in school, I've mentioned this to you before, and I was being told in the predominantly white school that I went to, when they put the picture of a Viking with the two horns and blonde hair and told me that was my ancestor, I switched off from history altogether, because that was his story, but not mine. So we are now, as a people, the various ethnicities, the various black communities and cultures are traversing a path that's reconnecting us with our illustrious history. And we are a proud people, and we are a strong people, and we are a resilient people, so much so that 400 years on, with the brutality that has been meted out to these generations, we're still here. Yeah. We're still here. And I ask you to name one set of peoples in history who have withstood what black communities are continuing to withstand. And I say this not in arrogance, but for the other cultures and other ethnicities to acknowledge this and realize we need to support them as they supported us historically, as they continue to support us in our plights. When it comes to Afghanistan, Kashmir, you will see that we don't make any distinction that, oh, it's not a black cause, so we're not going to be there. They need to join with us in the oppression that we've been receiving systemically, institutionally. We are among the few who have inherited poverty. When the slavery was abolished, and I'll leave this and pass it back to you, when slavery was abolished, and we have the British praising themselves and patting themselves on the back, they recompensed the slave traders and slave owners millions of pounds. What was given to the black emancipated slaves? Oh, in America, it's 40 acres and a mule. But as there's the society we live in today is still living off that inherited wealth from slavery, the infrastructure. You look around the country, and universities are acknowledging this now. The banks have acknowledged this. What about the inherited poverty, that generational poverty? Because those at the bottom of the rung, their descendants have never been on an even keel and an even footing as everyone else. Now, cultural Muslims, they have a connection back to their home countries, and many have wealth in that instance. And if they didn't have wealth, they came together and with that family structure built their wealth. Converts have been disconnected in that instance when many of us have come to Islam, and many of those who came from the West Indies didn't have that structure. They came from slavery descendancy. So look at the platforms that we are starting from. And yet we're being told, why do they complain? Why have they got chips on their shoulder? As Malcolm X said, it's not a chip on my shoulder, it's your foot on my neck. So we need to consider that. I ask others to consider that when they've got a negative feeling concerning why are black people speaking in this way now? Because that always happens. When black communities, black individuals speak, they almost want us to be quiet and diminish our argument. And this is problematic in itself as well. So I ask the viewers, I ask the listeners, really look inside yourself and ask yourself this. If you've got issues with what you're hearing and you've got prejudices and racism towards black people today, then you should have that same feeling against the Prophet ﷺ's second wife, Sauda. You should resent her like you resent us. You should have the same feelings there. You should have the same feelings for Bilal ibn Rabah. You should have the same feelings for all of the black Sahaba. you should despise Musa or have the same resentment for Musa alayhi salam. I'm saying this, and this may be tough what I'm addressing individuals on, but if you've got that towards black people today, then it automatically should transfer to these examples that I've given now. And I hand it back to you, Wajid, with that very emphatic ending, because I want us to look deeply and really churn out what is inside of us. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Abdul Haqq. We're going to round it off there, inshallah. I don't have any response to what you've said, but nonetheless, it wasn't, I don't feel what you've said was for a response, but it was for reflection and contemplation. That if we say one thing, what does that mean? And, you know, going back to kind of what we discussed before, it's an idea. Where does it progress to that it actually becomes day-to-day wisdom? And it takes that self-awareness, and it takes courage as well to sort of say, look, I've got a problem here. You know what I mean? I'll be honest with you, here where we live in Newcastle, there's not many black people. When I went to primary school, I was the only ethnic minority in that primary school, and I was black. That's how non-black this area used to be. And but when we went to secondary school, there were some black kids that went there as well, and that environment bonded us. Do you understand? It didn't matter what background we came from. We just knew that each of us were going through some kind of hell that we could relate to, you know, on a day-to-day basis in school. That there were moments where it was just some of the best days of my lives, but some absolutely horrendous days as well. And I think it takes that self-awareness and self-reflection, but also to not necessarily like I can't walk in your shoes. It's as simple as that. I can't walk, and I'm not going to pretend to be able to walk in your shoes either. But what I can do is try to, I don't know, I suppose, connect with you in that sense. Like you said, there's a human element, but there's also that faith element that Musa alayhi salam, you know, one of our revered prophets, you know, Moses.
Allah spoke to Kalamallahu Musa takliman. Allah spoke directly to Musa. This is who this individual is.
Yeah. You know, lead your people. That one who had the stutter, and then Allah unraveled their tongue, and Allah, you know, with the staff, raise your staff, do this, have faith in me, I will take care of you. And like you said, the king of Abyssinia, who took in those who were being persecuted, and had they not been able to cross that threshold, Islam would have looked completely different today in what it was. But it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't just that the Abyssinian king showed them empathy. It was, he showed them his wisdom and his knowledge, and he took care of them in a way that a true king would do, you know, give them that refuge and that sanctity that they needed at that time. Right. And again, you know, with Bilal radiallahu anh, we have to remember, he will be the first person to enter Jannah.
Yes.
He, you know, and there's a beautiful hadith where, you know, the Prophet ﷺ says to him that you will be the first one to enter Jannah. And subhanAllah, his love for the Prophet ﷺ was so much that he said, I will not enter Jannah where, subhanAllah, where you are not there.
SubhanAllah.
So the Prophet ﷺ said, is because you will be holding the reins to my horse as we ride into Jannah.
Allah.
You know, and this is the status that was given to Bilal radiallahu anh. You know,
yes,
and that he was the first mu'adhin, and I think from that perspective, from a human perspective, from a faith perspective, if we can nurture that love, that respect, and that appreciation, I think we can start to see each other more as humans, and start to unravel that mist that descends when we look at people through that particular, you know, that vision, and say, oh, this is the shape this person is, and this is the box that they fit into. And I think, and I just like
Abdul put his head on the ground when he insulted or used a word that was used as a connotation of insult.
Derogatory,
and he put his head on the ground, this great Sahaba. We need to put our heads on the ground, metaphorically speaking, for the racism that we've been displaying towards each other. And if we say we follow the Sunnah, if we say that we follow our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, no other action, metaphorically speaking, is required except this, to rid this insidious disease from us.
May Allah protect us and purify us and guide us.
Ameen.
Dr. Abdul Haqq, we will continue this discussion next Monday, sisters and brothers, and I mean that in the broadest sense. Ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers who have been viewing, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the comments. I'm sorry I haven't really had a chance to get through, but if you do have any questions, you do have any sort of feedback you have, drop it in for us. We're really ready to open this up and carry on this discussion. And like you said, this is the beginning of our discussion. We'll be covering many aspects of identity and exploring it in many ways, inshallah. This is the most relevant thing right now, and I think it's a brilliant place to start. I want to thank you again, Dr. Abdul Haqq, Jazakallah khair for joining us this evening. And inshallah, to all of our viewers and listeners, inshallah, we will join you, inshallah, next Monday, 8 p.m. We look forward to it. Barakallahu feek for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.